The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the 5th day of this Rohatsu Sesshin here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico in December 2024. A time of chaos, a time of violence, a time where a lot of unexpected things have happened, and all of this can throw people off track. For those of you who have a difficult time with change, and most people have a difficult time with some level of change, but this is major level of change. Blockages everywhere, multiple blockages of everywhere. We may be accustomed to, for example, having a challenging time making a telephone call for a repair or something, and finding ourselves cut off, or finding ourselves having to make multiple attempts before the call goes through, a lot of things like that. But in this case, there's much more going on than just simple blocks. There are multiple blocks. And for many people, this is a very, very challenging time. There's a lot of fear and anxiety in the world, understandably. There's a lot of violence in the world. We're in the midst of several wars which are expanding, and untold suffering. But Zen practice did not maintain for 2.5 millennia because it was ineffective. If it had been ineffective, it would have died long ago. But it's incredibly effective. And one of the aspects of particularly Rinzai Zen, but any Zen practice, and theoretically, any spiritual practice, if we're fortunate in finding one that does have that attribute, is an ability to help people master the challenges of change. This has always been important in our lives, but it's even more important now. In the United States, most surprisingly, at least from some points of view, a man who's a known felon, been charged and found guilty of crimes, who's known to be unethical, who's known to be, well, not exactly the person that you ordinarily would think of as a president of the United States. Now, this said, many, many countries have had presidents who have been as blatantly inappropriate for the job as it appears that this upcoming president is. And it was a big surprise to many people that the person running against him, who was far more ethical, far more down to earth, far more pleasant to hear, did not get elected. Whatever side you voted for, it's still a puzzle as to why one would want to vote for someone who has that kind of a background as the person who got elected. But then things change. And things don't always change the way we want them to. The Buddha, millennia ago, taught that suffering comes as a result of not being able to change, in essence. That things change and we're thrown off are thrown off by that change. And particularly if it's a change that surprises us or was not something that we wanted to have. And we suffer when we try to hang on to the old. That's one of the Four Noble Truths. The first one being life is characterized by anywhere between mild discomfort and devastating suffering. There are people who have committed suicide out of the extremity of physical pain. There are people who have committed suicide out of much less, out of anger, for example. And there are always people who are unhappy with change. We try to hang on to the old, and it doesn't work. It never works. Change happens. An extreme end of change is what's called a shamanic initiation, in which, as someone described it, everything old is ripped away, so there's room for the new. And it's almost as if people are going through that extremity of change in this era. The fourth era, and the most volatile, violent, and challenging era of the four rotating eras taught in Hinduism. They range from the first era and it is quite pleasant and wonderful. Then the next era of the four gets a little bit more challenging. The third era increasingly so. And the fourth era, which is called the Kali Yuga, gets overridingly challenging, painful, lots of stuff happening. Mass shootings, which never would have happened 100 years ago. For one thing, there weren't the kinds of weapons that you could do a mass shooting with so quickly and easily. We've had a president assassinated. We've had his brother assassinated. We had Martin Luther King assassinated. And we live in cities that have big challenges. And even the weather can be a big challenge. Earlier this year, 2 hurricanes arrived in quick succession of each other, landing on Florida and doing vast desecration to that area. I noticed that in the grocery stores, for example, there are no Florida oranges. It's entirely logical. The hurricanes have wiped out the oranges on the trees if they haven't even actually wiped out the whole tree. Another of the hurricanes, the second one, went all the way up into the mountains of North Carolina, which is quite far away from Florida, and did immense damage. One of my sisters lives in Asheville, North Carolina, a lovely little town, and the electricity went out for weeks. The water plant was negatively impacted, if not destroyed, and the water system was so damaged, if not destroyed, and some of it was destroyed, that it's unknown when the residents of Asheville, North Carolina, will get public water again. That kind of thing was rare. And it wasn't as intense because the storms were not as intense as far as we know, historically, nor were they as frequent or as many of them in a storm year. We've had earthquakes all over the world. The seas appear to be rising. I know in Norfolk, Virginia, where one of my kids lives, the waters regularly, at high tide, regularly flood the streets very close to where he is. And some houses have actually been raised a whole floor just so they can survive. I don't know quite how they get to their house if the water is going to be like that, but I assume somebody's figured it out. And there's all kinds of work all over the world with trying to figure out how to protect our shorelines and our cities that are at the shore from becoming inundated with water. I used to have a subscription, a digital subscription to National Geographic, which was actually quite wonderful because the cover photo was interactive. And there was one about rising seas. And it showed that by whatever the date was, where the water would have risen where the water would have risen in this year and that year and the next year and the next year on the Statue of Liberty. And at the final stage that they were estimating, it was up to her waist. That's pretty high. And a lot of New York would be underwater at that point. There's all kinds of arguments, especially these days, as to whether or not global warming is an event. There are people who deny it. And one of the things that has been in the news recently is that the extreme conservative groups have been requiring, under the Freedom of Information Act, emails and texts of all government workers who mention climate change, diversity, the name of the soon-to-be president, the name of the current president. And if it goes through as he hopes it will, there's going to be two very conservative people who are going to, quote, make the federal government smaller, more efficient. And if those research papers get into the hands of these people, what you will really be seeing is not a thinning out of the government in a healthy way, but a thinning out of the government to get rid of anyone who does not personally agree with the current upcoming administration. That's not exactly right. In fact, it's quite unethical. But it is one of the things that has been spoken of in recent weeks. There are a lot of concerns about climate change. It's being linked to the increased violence of storms, the increased frequency of storms, the rising seas. There are houses, their homes that are falling into the sea because they're built too close for the current situation. And then there's other stuff in people's lives. We just had a power surge here at Mountain Gate, which revealed a damaged underground main electrical line, and it had to be dug up and replaced and sleeved to be safe. And so far, it has cost us $15,000. This is an extreme expense for us. And then 2 days ago, during sesshin, our dishwasher failed. One of our people here was an expert in getting it troubleshot, but the final conclusion after many hours and 2 days of investigation is that it's nothing we can fix ourselves. This is, again, the kind of thing that is happening for people all over. Groups of challenges. So what can we do about it as Zen students? The first noble truth is that life is characterized by dukkha, which is a word that you heard defined earlier. It goes anywhere between mild dissatisfaction to agony. And the second noble truth is that suffering comes because we cling. We cling to things. We don't want change, or we do want change. If we're in a difficult situation, we want to get out of it as soon as we can. We want to change that situation. If we're in a very pleasant situation, we want to keep it. And of course, it's going to change. There's a sort of a teaching story in which a man in a very fancy house hears a knock on the door in the evening, and he opens the door, and there's this absolutely beautiful woman. And she says, "May I come in?" And he says, "Oh, of course. What can I get you? Would you like something to drink? Have a seat. What you come for?" And as soon as she's in and seated, there's another knock on the door, and he goes again, and there's this ugly hag who rasps, "Can I come in?" He says, "No way," and slams the door. And she opens it, and she says, "My sister's already in here. Wherever she goes, I follow. She is pleasure, I am pain." But then again, there was a king who supposedly asked his jeweler to create a ring that would always keep him from being in pain. And the jeweler created the ring, and on it he had carved, "This too shall change." So what was the next step in this? We can be free from being caught in change, in difficulty, in challenge, no matter how deep the challenge is, through Zazen, through going deep within ourselves and uncovering the various different places in our being, and there are many usually for everybody, where we are caught in historic trauma, caught in ideas about ourselves that are inaccurate, and so we act in ways that bring us discomfort and people sneering at us or whatever, unpleasantness. And this is why Zen practice is difficult. As someone wrote, Roshi Kapleau decades ago when she had a kensho. She said she had to virtually nail herself to the mat in the zendo, which is exactly how I felt for 2 years doing zazen. And then she said, but this practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. As we continue to do our zazen, we are able to open to places where we've sort of shut down or hidden from ourselves that are painful or unpleasant. We don't necessarily have to relive the experience, but whatever the experience was, it is stuck energetically in our body. And to tune into our body through what is known as the felt sense, a term coined by Eugene Gendlin, who wrote a book called Focusing, in which he described how to tune in for people who are in distress. And it's incredibly effective. Not only that, but it is the same discovery that a highly regarded Tibetan teacher, Longchenpa, had taught centuries before. When we do tune in to the energy in our body, even if it's pretty wild, and we stay present with it long enough, frequently enough, that eventually it simply, the world, what my experience is, it sort of, you'll feel this, as it relieves. And then whatever was triggering it, and again, that is not necessarily something we have to go into. We just have to go into the energy that's stuck as a result of whatever that experience was, and tune in, because it's stuck there in our body. And when we tune in fully, we are allowing it to release and simply dissolve. It's incredibly effective. And it is a very effective tool in our Zen practice. Along with that, we have in Rinzai Zen the extended out-breath, called in Rinzai Susokan. And it also is an incredible tool, particularly when we take it out as far as it can go without gasping, and with a sense that if we do this long enough, it will reveal something most precious to us, something we've longed to return to, something most people have some sense that there is something more peaceful, more flexible, more happy, more free, really, than what we're undergoing in our life generally. And it is true. But it is a long process to awaken to this deep truth of our true nature, because we've got it covered up by assumptions, by conditioning, by our experiences that we've drawn conclusions about ourselves about normally, and so on. And with Zen practice, we are opening to recognizing those experiences and the depths to which we are caught in them. And when we do this from a place of practice, my experience, after we've had the first few experiences of that, we are hugely relieved to be opening to some other aspect of our personality, for example, that has brought us pain. And because once we see it, remorse regret normally comes up. And then the next time the habit pattern would take us to that same place of acting that out, it's almost like we have a warning sign that says, do you want to do this again? You saw how you regretted it. You saw how painful it was. Do you really want to do it again? And it's so easy not to. Continuing in this way, we become increasingly free. To express our true nature without any attachments. Like I said, it's a long process. But we can, if we persist, accomplish this. I've been practicing for more than 50 years, and I'm so immensely grateful for this practice, even though the first 2 years were extremely difficult and painful because I couldn't even focus my mind. Even though growing up, I'd always been able to, at least in school, focus on my studies. At home, that was a different situation. And I would find myself, for example, clearing the table after dinner, putting the salt and pepper shakers in the refrigerator, which of course is not where they belong. I apologize for all this coughing. Still trying to find the source of it. So far, I haven't, but I expect someday I will, or else it'll continue until I die. And hopefully, hopefully I won't pull it into the next life. But if I do, that's fine too. I just apologize for the disruption it caused for people. And sometimes the concern if I really get into a coughing fit. It's been tested extensively. There is no illness. There's no infection. There's not even allergies. But nonetheless, I cough. The extended out breath, as you've heard in Teisho's before, is an extremely effective tool for focusing our minds. And this is probably why I couldn't do it in the beginning. Well, it wasn't taught in Rochester. Just following the breath was taught, or counting the breath. But that was difficult. I couldn't do that because I was so deeply invested in not feeling, because I had so much history behind me that was painful, and I didn't want to feel again. Some of it was actually terrifying. But all of it, eventually, I was able to work through between the Zazen, many sessions, and the help of therapy. Life has changed radically for me over those years. I'm sure I have more work to do. Don't we all? Even Mitra-roshi, my last teacher, had said, had described his deep awakening experience as, all I have to do is receive. Not like this, not like this, but simply open to the energy in the moment. And the clarity was so deep and so clear that it was natural, the response, and it was naturally appropriate, the response. Still, for several years while I was at Sogenji, every day he would be constantly speaking to himself, Zange, 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 which is an apology for misdeeds. When he came to Zen practice, actually as he was growing up, he did not want to do anything that involved Buddhism. He'd grown up in a Buddhist temple. His father was a priest, and this was in an era where priests were not very highly regarded. There'd been a real challenge a couple of centuries before, or not even a couple of centuries before, where there was a big uprising against Buddhism in Japan. Many temples were destroyed, and if they weren't destroyed, then the support for those temples was gone. It disappeared. And priests became essentially funeral directors. People in Japan are married in a Shinto ceremony, and often, if they're wealthy enough, as well in a what they call a white wedding, which looks just like American weddings. If they're older, and it's a later marriage or a remarriage when they've been divorced or something, which of course is anathema in Japan. Divorce is extremely looked down upon. But if the couple is older, say in their 50s, then they will often get married in a Buddhist temple. But normally, you go into a Buddhist temple in your casket. So priests did not have much respect. And he didn't want to be a priest. And he was not required to be, because his older brother, who would have inherited the temple, and did inherit the temple when his parents died, was. And that was his duty as the eldest son, regardless of what he wanted to do. But Mitra-roshi didn't like himself, and he wanted to become a psychologist so he could change himself. And then one day, he encountered a deeply, profoundly quiet and peaceful Mitra-roshi on a bus in Kyoto. And it turns out that they both exited at the same place, and he followed Mitra-roshi to where he was going, which was to his temple at the time. Mitra-roshi's father had asked him to take some papers to that temple, to go early. He was in college at the time, and to take papers to that temple. And so he did. It was one of the Myoshinji sub-temples. But he was so impressed, so deeply moved by the energy of Mitra-roshi, who was obviously a Buddhist priest, but certainly didn't act like the funeral director types. And so when he finished college, he walked on foot through the mountains to, by then, Kobe, where Mitra-roshi was teaching at Shofukuji. And he became his student and eventually his successor. because of that simple encounter. That is what Zen practice can offer to us. Not hiking over the mountains barefoot, but being so deeply quiet and peaceful that all we have to do is receive whatever comes to us, and there's no caught places. We don't feel pressured. We don't feel caught. We don't feel insulted. It just doesn't happen when we are that free, because we have let go the clinging that captures us and keeps us from being free. This is what Zen practice promises, if we are willing to go through it long enough. There's a story about a monk who was getting tired of practice or frustrated and wanted to have instant kensho, asking his teacher, "How long is it going to take me?" And the teacher said, 10 years. And the student said, 10 years? And the master said, in that case, then it'll take you 20 years. If we allow ourselves to give ourselves to our practice, and that can be a big challenge, we will gradually winnow out our stuck places, as Chisan calls them. Chisan being the long time student first of Mitra-roshi at Shofukuji, where she trained side by side with Mitra-roshi. And then Mitra-roshi asked her to go to Sogenji when he was sent there to teach, to help him. It works. If we're willing to go the distance, it works. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.